Good evening, everybody, YouTube. This is the Reverend again. I'm taking time up on a Wednesday evening. Uh, I'm here to talk about the PS4 NEO and also the reflections about what sort of issues it might cause for developers. If you recall, me and my buddies have done multiple videos following the rumors of the upgraded PS4. It started with Microsoft going out of their way to say that they were interested in doing upgradable hardware within the console generation. About a week after that, Sony themselves, actually there came out rumors of Sony working on an upgraded PS4 that a lot of people dubbed the PS4.5. A week later than that, there was even more substantiated rumors from even more development sources saying that the rumors were exactly true and that there was an upgraded PS4 in the works that everybody dubbed the PS4K. Just 2 days ago, there was a release confirming that there is indeed an official development set under the codename of the PS4 NEO that would enable developers to go ahead and make 4K capable games for the PlayStation 4. Now, if you've seen the other videos that we've put out, you'll know that there's actually quite a few reasons for them to do this. The first one being that the PS4 VR, or Project Morpheus as it used to be called, is right around the corner. The pre-orders have already been bought up. It's ready to hit the markets, and that's going to hit the markets around October time. Well, the caveat to it, as far as working with the current version of the PS4 hardware, is that the PS4 hardware is woefully underpowered in comparison to the PC counterparts that run VR devices like the HTC Vive or the Oculus Rift. The biggest issue being that you have pretty much a set of hardware that it's not going to be able to sit there and even do 1080p VR at full 60 frames per second, much less something in 4K. Reason being is that in order to do 1080p in virtual reality in a 3D display, you actually have to run what's equivalent of two 1080p screens right next to each other, and then the pictures have to oscillate on and off. One picture for your left eye, the other one for your right eye. When you're going to create the look of something moving at 60 frames per second in a 3D view like that through stereo vision, the pictures have to oscillate at 120 hertz. In other words, it has to push 120 frames per second in order for it to show up at 60 frames per second. If you're pushing it at 90 hertz, it's going to show up at 40 frames per second. Likewise, if you're pushing it at 60 hertz, you're only going to see 30 frames per second when you're viewing it through VR. So the current PS4 hardware is woefully underpowered to handle VR, even if you're just doing 1080p. So Sony obviously wants to go ahead and rectify that, and I don't know whether or not it was through pressures that hearing that Microsoft themselves, their main competition in the game console race, was thinking about doing their own hardware refresh, but they went out of their way and they decided that they would push the PS4 NEO out to developers for them to develop games. Now, this creates interesting situations for us as consumers. The one thing, the few things that we do know about the PS4 NEO is that it's going to retail for $399.99, so it's going to be $400. It's got a faster CPU, faster GPU, and faster RAM. In fact, Eurogamer was actually the main site that went ahead and posted up the specs and how that would actually affect everything. I'll leave a link in the video below. And you'll be able to go out of your way and check that one out to see all of the numbers and everything and how that theoretically fits. But in summary, basically what they say is that any sort of upgrades as far as what's running around for the PS4 currently over to the PS4K is that it will be running at a much higher, anything that you have on the PS4 Neo is going to run at a much higher frame rate, and it's going to stay at that frame rate for a longer stable time, which is absolutely important to VR, because if you have that frame rate, dropping or spiking erratically, then what happens after that is that it causes motion sickness and nausea. And the last thing you want is creating the PS4 VR, putting that out there, and pretty much having people, wear a $500 migraine machine on their head. Excuse me, $400, migraine generator on their head. That's not what you want to do. If people get sick on a regular basis, they're just not going to use the product, and that's going to create a lot of issues. Now, as far as consumers go, that puts you kind of in a weird spot. Do you pick up a PS4, regular PS4? Maybe you've already picked up a regular PS4. Or do you pick up a brand new PS4 Neo when it comes out? Well, the upside of what Sony has verified is that all the games that they release going forward are going to be compatible for both the PS4 and the PS4 Neo. They're basically going to run with one disc with two different modes, and two different sets of assets to go ahead and run on the system. One on a base mode, which runs for the base original PS4 hardware specs, and one in the Neo mode, which will run on the newer PS4 Neo specs. Now, this right here, that's what's going to be causing a huge amount of issues and unhappiness and angst amongst developers. I've said in videos before that one of the biggest things the biggest issues that are going to be caused by mid-generation hardware upgrades like this is that it's going to create issues for developers. And not only is it going to create issues, it's going to create really, really, really hard. It's a nightmare. All right, in the making. Now, a lot of YouTubers out there have said that maybe, since the architecture for the PS4 is similar to any 32-bit PC or an x86 PC, that shouldn't it be just like any other PC title out there, where you can sit there and adjust graphic settings and sliders and things like that. Just set one on high for the Neo and one on low for the base PS4. Well, unfortunately, it's not that simple. There's a few things that are going on here. When they release out the PS4 Neo, they're gonna still have the original PS4 on shelves. So what's going to happen is that although they're not going to go ahead and completely disenfranchise the 40 million PS4 owners that currently have the system, currently have the original base system, they're going to essentially split their own particular market share of the industry. They're going to have folks who are going to have their old hardware, and they're going to have folks with the newer hardware. What they've required from the developers, like I said, they have to have all of their games running going forward in a base mode and a Neo mode. So basically, you have to go ahead and develop two different versions of the game. Either you develop from the base mode and then you build up new assets, or you develop for the Neo mode and then you include step-down assets and step-down system files. The problem with that is that you can't sit there and plan out development for a software title and say, okay, well, this is all part of one SKU. This is all part of one game. No, you have to sit there and you have to plan out QA and development for basically 2 different versions of whatever game you have. A lot of developers already have games in development. Now they have to add on the fact that they need to run it in 2 modes. Guess what? That's all stuff that probably hasn't been planned for initially. That's also stuff that um, they didn't have the budget pulled or approved from the publishers who were working with them initially, and now they have to go out of their way to go ahead and get those funds. That's all red tape and paperwork nightmare. I mean, it's hard enough to go ahead and make sure that you have a working version of your software for one platform. Essentially, right now, if they are going to go ahead and develop it for the PS4 NEO, they're pretty much developing for 2 platforms. That right there is really difficult. That's number one. So all development efforts, including planning and budget, those all have to increase. These developers already have deadlines, and they already have agreements with publishers to go ahead and finish games by a certain date. All right, but they have to do that for all the games going forward for the PS4 base model and the PS4 NEO. Nightmare. Second thing that they have to worry about, as far as any games that they've already published that are already on the system, they can go out of their way to make sure that it runs on the NEO hardware with NEO features by patching things going forward. The problem with that, though, is that, and I'm not going to speak for all developers, but I currently work with a software developer, and we do mobile applications for both iOS and Android. So I'm familiar with doing multiple SKUs, multiple versions of the same piece of software or application. The problem with when you're a developer and you have to go back and you have to patch things is that, and I'm not speaking for all developers and all their relationships with their particular publishers and everything else, but when you're dealing as a developer working on patches, many times that particular work is not considered part of the core development work that you are contracted with whenever you started your project. A lot of times that's considered maintenance. Guess what? You may not be paid for maintenance. And that's a shitload of work to do. Now, where I see this really hurting people isn't really the bigger publishers or the developers who went ahead and worked with bigger publishers and put out games for bigger publishers. What about the indie developers who have smaller games that they want to make sure that those work with the PS4 NEO and all of those customers that will end up having those PS4 NEOs going into the future? The general idea is that Sony, like I said, initially is going to have the PS4, the base model, and the PS4 NEO both on the market at the same time. When it's going to hit the market, unfortunately, they haven't given a proper date. But considering a lot of this stuff kind of coincides with the release of the PS4 VR, I wouldn't be surprised if we see something around October. We'll probably see something or hear something from Sony at E3. But if they have those particular consoles out on the market at the same time, inevitably what's going to happen is that they're going to slow down the production of the PS4 base model. Okay, that's all. That hardware is going to become cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, and they're going to slow down production until they stop producing that. Then the only thing that's going to be out on the market, probably not right away, maybe in a year or two, is going to be the PS4 NEO or the PS4 version, PS4 NEO version of the PS4 hardware. With that, you have all of these. Well, right now, if you think about it, you have almost a full 3 years of PlayStation 4 games released for the base hardware that may need to be patched just to run on the new hardware. because there may be some things that it might depend on. It might depend on clock speed or RAM speed to go ahead and handle animation or processing cycles or anything else on a particular game. So you have this huge, not a huge library, but you have a pretty substantial library of games that have been released already over the past 3 years that will probably require patching by developers to make sure that they run correctly on the Neo hardware. And like I said, those particular patches, all of that work and everything else, that's never been accounted for. That wasn't in the original plan. That, you know, and the thing is that if it is considered, depending on the developer and publisher contract, as the maintenance job, you have developers who may not even be getting paid for that particular work. You know, it's really a sticky situation, and I was gonna go out of my way, and I was gonna you know, claim a whole bunch of things, and I had a previous video that I made earlier today that really held this in a negative connotation. What's really probably going to happen is that it's going to be really difficult for developers, especially initially when they go through the learning curve of making sure that they have the 2 versions set up on their games. Now, a year from now, maybe 2 years from now, it's probably not going to be that big of a deal. And when it comes to developers and publishers, it's going to be another thing that they're going to be able to plan for, because it's something that they've already have slated. But right now, we have all these changes, and basically another set of development projects set for developers to end up on this new console. It's a really difficult thing to deal with, and you know, it's going to be really hard to sit there and maintain developer confidence or even publisher confidence in the console, especially if this is something that, you know, what if it ends up as a second boon for the PlayStation or Sony? What's going to stop them from doing an upgrade again in another 3 years along the same course? Or if we end up moving on to another generation of hardware, what's going to stop them from doing another major jump in the middle of the hardware generation? It's one of those things that I think Sony has to be very careful of, because we've seen hardware developers and first-party publishers do things like this. I'm old enough to remember when the Sega Genesis was out, and then they did the Sega CD and then the 32X, and then they asked, you know, publishers and developers that if you're going to put out games for the Sega Genesis, that you got to put it out for the Sega CD and the 32X. What ended up happening was that, you know, Sega splintered and fractured their own market share. It worked against them. It didn't help them at all. And the thing with consoles is that, you know, a lot of people who game primarily on consoles are used to dealing with a fixed hardware set, and they're used to dealing with not having to worry about multiple versions of the game or having to worry about, you know, minimum spec requirements, because the spec requirements are always the same. It's going to be pretty interesting as far as what happens over the next 6 months. First thing we have to do is pay attention to E3, see what Sony says there. Hopefully there will be more details, hopefully a release date. And then after E3, you know, once everything opens up and they actually start selling the PS4 NEO hardware, we have to pay attention to what the trends are, and if Sony decides, you know, it worked out once, maybe it's something they can do again. It's not something I'm looking forward to. Although I think I'm fortunate for the fact that I haven't picked up PS4 yet. And now that I know this is coming out, I'm probably going to pick one up. It looks like more toward the end of the year. With that, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for spending the last 20 minutes or so with me. If you're so kind, please hit the like button, hit subscribe. I've got, you know, links to the other YouTube videos that talked about this, and also the Eurogamer article. And you know, if you have any comments, or if there's an angle that I've missed at all, please leave them below. I encourage communication. You know, because the thing is that as fun as these YouTube videos are, the general truth is that, you know, I'm going to present things, and you might like it, you may not like it, but in the end, it really doesn't matter if you agree or disagree. If for 1 second I cause you to go stop, think, and consider what I'm saying, then I've already achieved something. Have a good night.